Hello and welcome back to I Completed 80s Music, the only podcast taking you through the entire decade of music one song at a time. I'm your host, the 80s Mixtaper, and today we plunge headlong into the back six tracks of Playlist 49. Before we crack on, just a little show and tell from my good self. For the second year in a row, I attended Rewind in Henley last weekend, and what a fantastic Saturday it was too. Unfortunately, we couldn't stay for the Sunday as well as we had stuff to do, but the Saturday itself was amazing. We arrived with Dave Hill's Slade performing, and considering it's mid-August, of course they did Merry Christmas Everybody as their final song. Of course they did. Top Loader then performed, and I have not seen them live since they were coming up around 2000, and they haven't lost a step. Their usual hits like Achilles' Heel and Dancing in the Moonlight were superb, but actually it was their covers that really hit the nail on their head. Their Mr. Blue Sky was one of the songs of the day and got everyone up on their feet. We then had the Trevor Horn Band, one of my bucket list bands, and I'm delighted to say he did not disappoint. And it was also lovely to see Lol Cream perform with him. Naturally, with it being Trevor Horn, the band were like precision engineering, well drilled, well rehearsed, as they shot through 6 songs from Video Killed the Radio Star through to Frankie's Relax. Shout out as well to Ryan Malloy, who sung the Holly Johnson part, dare I say, as good as Holly Johnson. We then had Soul to Soul, and wow, you just forget how good they were. Ghetto Heaven, Back to Life, What's the Meaning of Life, all of the hits. Possibly my favourite act of the day, and I think they're touring, so if you get the chance to see them, do so. Sonia did a great show covering for Pete Wiley, who unfortunately had to pull out. It was wonderful to see Annabella from Bow Wow Wow knock out their 3 hits. Blancmange absolutely smashed it, especially with Feel Me Now and Walking on the Ceiling, which of course we'll be talking about in this very episode. Louise was surprisingly good, and I think even she was surprised by how good the Rewind house band were in backing her, and she even managed to dive into some Eternal classics, which was a nice touch. Roland Giff was good and did a lot of crowd work, and then came Kim Wilde. All I can say is that it was like a religious experience. She was wow, and I have to say she's still really hot. They ran a really long extended version of Kids in America right at the end, and the entire crowd was on their feet. No one wanted it to end. She was incredible and just has not lost a step in 45 years. So all in all, a really great day. If you've never been before, do get yourself down to Rewind next year. It's always a lovely day out. Loads of people dress up from all ages. And in terms of fancy dress, I mean, we had everything from the entire cast of Baywatch to a guy dressed up as Evil Edna from Will-O-the-Wisp. And if you can see some of these groups on tour, I highly recommend all of them. Today, we complete October 1982, and what a show it promises to be. Heaven 17 released the song they're most proud of as they released the album The Luxury Gap. We meet a favourite of my mum's, Supertramp, for one glorious weather-based track. We then meet the Aussies, Men at Work, and set them up for a massive hit in early 1983. Renee and Renato have me doing bad impressions. Bet you can't wait for that one. Rush return and go synth with the song about suburban alienation. And we end today with Blancmange's big hit, which, as I mentioned, I saw at the weekend. As usual, due to pesky copyright laws, we can't actually feature the songs in the episode. But to combat that, I've created 13-song playlists for both Spotify and Apple Music, almost like the compilations of the 80s that you will find in the episode description, so you can play along at home. Just in case the pod links don't work on your podcast platform of choice, you will also find a full track list for each episode, also in the description. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, you can find me on the socials as the 80s Mixtaper, or do feel free to email to completed80s, that's 80s, at AOL.com, completed80s at AOL.com. And if you'd like to chuck a £5 my way in support of the podcast, you can also find my Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. And if you do kindly donate, I will roast your name on the next pod episode by putting you in an 80s band situation. But without further ado, let's get back to the music. So we start today with the realisation that all the synth pop coolness and angst has turned into something commercial. The Blitz kids and the kids from Liverpool, Birmingham and Sheffield are now printing their own money, be it Duran Duran, Spandau, ABC. The futuristic promise of the British electronic underground is officially currency. Think back to where we left the next protagonists in March 1981, episode 21.5. Heaven 17, the splinter project born from Martin Ware and Ian Craig Marsh walking away from the original Human League. They unleash their single. It is called We Don't Need This Fascist Groove Thing. It is a blistering, high BPM collision of hyper-politicised post-punk ideals and pioneering left-field funk. It's brilliant. It's also completely banned by the BBC due to its lyrical references to Ronald Reagan and fascism. But pop music is a game of calculated adaptation. While their former colleague Phil Oakey takes his newly retooled Human League to the top of the global charts with Don't You Want Me, the boys in Heaven 17, now fully aligned with vocal powerhouse Glenn Gregory, decide that this is the course of action they should also take. They're not abandoning their soul or their synthesizers, they're just giving them a high-end studio gloss. They are constructing their second studio album, The Luxury Gap. This will yield the chart-busting gospel pop explosion of Temptation, which we will absolutely most positively hear on this pod, as it's one of my favourite songs from the entire decade. But we're not there yet. Before then, there is a transitional piece of music. It is a track written on a modest TAC 4-track tape machine in a flat, initially evoking the cinematic sweep of a film soundtrack. The group strips away overtly aggressive political slogans to focus entirely on human heartbreak, isolated melancholy and sophisticated electronic. If Roxy gave us Sophistipop, maybe this is Sophistisynth. This is the lead single from The Luxury Gap, released on the 22nd of October 1982. This is Let Me Go. Track 8, playlist 49. When we return to the studio, the story of Let Me Go deepens into an exact science of happy accidents and bleeding edge gear. Martin Ware has openly confirmed in retrospective interviews that Let Me Go remains his absolute favourite song in the entire Heaven 17 catalogue. But getting it right required a trial and error process that perfectly charts the evolution of pop technology. According to an interview with Electricity Club, the song started with a melody played on a tiny Yamaha keyboard. As they took it into a commercial studio, they tried to make the song sound heavier. They tried adding a live bass guitar to inject weight, but it failed to fit the electronic aesthetic. They tried mimicking the low, dramatic acoustic piano notes popularised by Ultravox's Vienna, but that fell flat too. And good job too. By October 1982, even Vienna sounded antiquated despite only being released 20 months earlier. The breakthrough came via two distinct pieces of hardware. First, Ware manipulated a Roland Jupiter 8 synth, applying a heavy tape delay to a sweeping, filtering sound that gave the intro its distinctive atmosphere. Second, Ian Craig Marsh leaned heavily into a brand new quirky silver box from Japan, the Roland TB303 bass synthesizer. Originally manufactured by Roland in 1981 as a tool to simulate a real bass player for practicing guitarists, the TB303 was actually a commercial failure. But to British synth pop musicians like Heaven 17, its synthetic squelchy tone was perfect. Released in October 1982, Let Me Go was one of the very earliest commercial pop records to prominently feature the TB303, years before Chicago musicians would use that exact machine to invent acid house music. The production was notoriously maximalist behind the scenes. The song was recorded at Air Studios in London, and the opening choral line of Let Me Go is something of a marvel of multi-tracking, consisting of 118 separate vocal takes layered together via a massive physical tape loop running around the studio to generate a 14-part vocal harmony. However, when Virgin Records put the single out on the 22nd of October 1982, it didn't instantly storm the British charts, and it actually stalled at number 41 in the UK. Ironically, it would become the lowest charting single from the Luxury Gap, as subsequent releases like Temptation flew up to number 2. However, across the Atlantic, Let Me Go gave Heaven 17 a significant American breakthrough. Bolstered by a stylised black and white promotional music video that featured the band roaming a desolate London, dressed like 1940s detectives, the track entered heavy rotation on MTV. It climbed all the way to number 4 on the US Billboard Dance Club Songs chart. In an interview with The Quietus, Gregory recounted that their American club success culminated in a live performance at New York's iconic Ritz venue with none other than Public Image Limited frontman John Lydon standing in the crowd watching them play. Praise indeed from the punk who took Rebellion into the charts. Let's now have a brief flirtation with a band of the 70s, but we'll need an umbrella for this one. A dark cloud has rolled into our playlist, bringing a distinctively British weather pattern with it. Yes, it's time to face the drizzle. We're introducing a band that dominated the late 1970s with their polished art rock. But when the 1980s arrived, they only managed to squeeze out one solitary single top 40 hit in the UK. I am talking, of course, about Supertramp and their 1982 single, It's Raining Again. Before we look at the internal friction that was building inside this band, let's listen to the track itself. It kicks off with a signature, clean John Helliwell saxophone line, followed by those unmistakable bright Wurlitzer piano chords that became the band's sonic fingerprint. This is track 9. Now, if you only know Supertramp from their massive 1979 album Breakfast in America, which reached number 3 on the UK albums chart, you might have presumed a long-running success story was round the corner. And yet, it's the end of 1982 and we've not mentioned them on this pod. But the 1980s were not particularly kind to them in the UK singles chart. In fact, It's Raining Again was their one and only true UK hit of the decade, entering the charts on the 30th of October 1982 at number 61 and peaking at number 26 on the 18th of December during a 12-week chart run. It was a favourite of Radio 2 DJs and therefore a favourite of my mum. This is yet another of those sat on the stool pudding bowl haircut ensuing songs of that era. Supertramp was formed in London all the way back in 1969. The band was defined by two completely different songwriters, Rick Davies, who handled the bluesy direct rock tracks, and Roger Hodgson, who wrote the melodic, whimsical pop hits. While playing in a band called The Joint in 1969, keyboardist Richard Davies met a Dutch millionaire, affectionately known as Sam. Sam was so impressed with Davies' talent that he offered to back him financially if he formed a brand new band. Davies placed an advert in Melody Maker magazine. One of the responses came from a young Roger Hodgson, who initially joined as bassist. They initially called themselves Daddy before choosing a name inspired by W. H. Davies' 1910 book, The Autobiography of a Supertramp. With Sam bankrolling the group, they signed to A&M Records and released two early albums, a self-titled debut in 1970 and indelibly stamped in 1971. Neither album found an audience. Eventually, Sam generously cleared their accumulated band debts and left them to find their own destiny. Their massive breakthrough finally arrived in 1974 with their third studio album, Crime of the Century, which they dedicated to Sam. That album featured the brilliant single Dreamer, which surged into the top 20, peaking at number 13. From there, the band went from strength to strength, releasing Crisis What Crisis in 1979, Even in the Quietest Moments in 1977, and then The Inescapable Breakfast in America in 1979. However, by the time they gathered to record their 1982 studio album Famous Last Words, the creative partnership between Rick Davies and Roger Hodgson had become strained. The musical direction of the group was a major point of contention, and the atmosphere in the studio was stagnant. Rick Davies later compared the writing process to two people trying to paint a picture on exactly the same canvas. They could only agree on lighter songs for the track list, and Davies even withheld a 12-minute epic he had written because the vibes during the sessions were simply not forthcoming. It's Raining Again was credited to both Davies and Hodgson. Hodgson actually composed the track on a pump organ he affectionately called Grandma, a beautiful instrument he bought when he was 17 years old. He wrote it on a gloomy day in England when he was feeling sad because he had lost a friend. Originally, he conceived it as a much slower, deeply melancholy piece. However, when he brought it to the band for the studio sessions, he decided to ramp up the tempo. The result is this bizarre but brilliant pop contradiction, an upbeat sax-laden melody driving a song about a devastating romantic rejection. If you listen closely to the studio recording, Roger Hodgson actually sings every single vocal part you hear. He meticulously layered his own voice to create those lush, communal harmonies. It was only when they took the song on their famous Last Words tour that woodwind player John Helliwell and touring musician Scott Page stepped in to sing the lower vocal harmonies live while Hodgson handled the high notes. The track also ends with a deliberate piece of musical nostalgia. As the music fades out, children can be heard singing the traditional nursery rhyme, "It's raining, it's pouring." It is a classic Supertramp touch, a nice callback to all our childhoods. Shortly after the release of the album and its accompanying tour, Roger Hodgson officially left Supertramp in 1983, bringing the classic lineup to a permanent end. While Rick Davies continued to tour under the Supertramp name for decades until his passing in September 2025, they never reached these chart heights in the UK again. Their single was their final swan song in the British Top 40. For track 5, you find us cowering under a table half the world away in Australia as we introduce a new band to the mix, mainly for two specific songs, an absolute icon of the 80s and this next song, their introduction to the UK market. If you walk into any record shop or turn on your car radio, you're bound to hear a specific piercing saxophone hook. It's a nervous sound, it's a paranoid sound. It's the sound of someone sitting in a dark room, staring at a front door, praying that whoever is knocking on the other side will just go away. The sound is coming from Melbourne, Australia, by way of a Scottish immigrant with a booming voice and a gift for writing pop songs that felt entirely like anxiety attacks you could dance to. This is Who Could It Be Now by Men at Work. Men at Work will obviously release a song which we all remember if you were a kid in the 80s, and that's the global smash hit Down Under, a song seemingly about Vegemite and Chunder. Well, it's more than that, but those are the memorable bits. But we're not there yet. The story begins with Colin Hay. He was born in Kilwinning, Scotland in 1953 and grew up in the nearby town of Saltcoats. His parents ran a music shop, and in 1967, when Hay was 14 years old, his family emigrated from Scotland to Melbourne, Australia. By 1978, Hay was playing acoustic music around Melbourne. He crossed paths with a guitarist named Roy Stryker, and the two men formed an acoustic duo to perform together. They realised they needed a bigger, more dynamic sound to capture the attention of noisy Australian pubs. In 1979, they officially expanded the lineup and formed Men at Work. They recruited Jerry Spicer on drums. Soon after, Greg Ham joined the bass to play flute, saxophone and keyboards. Finally, John Reese joined on bass guitar, which allowed Ron Stryker to focus entirely on playing lead guitar. The band secured a regular Thursday night residency at the Cricketers Arms Hotel in Richmond, a suburb of Melbourne. Their live shows were high energy, mixing new wave rock with reggae rhythms and a sharp sense of humour. They grew so popular that they became the highest paid unsigned band in Australia. An American executive working for CBS Records discovered them playing the local pub circuit and signed them to a record deal. The band was paired with an American producer named Peter McClan. Together, they began recording what would become their massive debut album, Business as Usual. The very first single from that album was Who Can It Be Now? Colin Hay wrote the music for the song around 1979 while staying in a treehouse he and his girlfriend made in Bermagui in southern New South Wales. Hay explained that the musical idea popped out quickly, taking only about half an hour to write. However, the lyrics would not come until 1981. when Hay was living in an apartment complex in the St Kilda area of Melbourne. The inspiration came from his real-life living situation. Hay lived next to people who were involved in illegal drug activity. Because of this, people would frequently mistake his door for his neighbour's door, and he often found himself sitting inside his apartment listening to unexpected, aggressive knocking on his door in the middle of the night, feeling a genuine sense of dread and paranoia. He converted that real-world anxiety into a song about a man who wants complete isolation from the outside world. When the band recorded the track, Greg Ham added the distinctive staccato saxophone solo that opens the song and repeats throughout the chorus. And what a delicious hook that is. The single was released in Australia in 1981 and steadily climbed the domestic charts, reaching number 2. The American branch of CBS was initially hesitant to release the music, thinking it too uniquely Australian for US listeners. However, after the band's continued success in Australia, the single was pushed out to American radio stations in 1982. The song became a huge surprise hit on US radio and MTV. In October 1982, Who Can It Be Now officially reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Strangely, the UK hadn't quite bitten on the new formula yet though, and the song stalled at number 45. But it turned Men at Work into an overnight international phenomenon, paving the way for their even larger follow-up hit Down Under. What started as a half-hour writing session in a remote bush treehouse ended up creating the pathway for a song involving the word chunder. For track 11, look, this is no longer a comedy podcast, and I ditched the comedy around episode 7, but this next song brings out a certain something in me. It's a bad impression I can't resist doing, and I've done it ever since I was a kid. The 1980s has some weird and wonderful songs, and sometimes they get all the way to number 1, just like this next one did. And by the way, this is not just a number 1, folks. This, bless it, is the Christmas number 1 in the UK for 1982. Think about the cultural landscape of Great Britain at this exact moment. The charts are dominated by the post-New Romantic bands growing up. Sleek pop melodies were about to enter, almost like the 80s phase 2. You have the Jam releasing their final farewell single, Beat Surrender. You have Phil Collins preparing a Motown cover that will dominate the coming weeks. The air is crisp, the high streets are full of shoppers, and the nation is waiting to find out what song will define their Christmas. The Christmas number 1 in the UK is almost like a secular holy day, a collective cultural consensus. And in 1982, that crown did not go to a Weller, a Hadley, a Le Bon or a Michael. It went to a middle-aged Italian singing waiter and a British session vocalist delivering a hyper-dramatic, unashamedly theatrical operatic pop ballad. Here comes my god-awful impression. That song was Save Your Love, My Darling, Save Your Love by Renee and Renato. God help us. No more bad impressions, normal service now resumes. This is about to be one of the most unusual yet nostalgic tours of a song this podcast ever does. If somehow you're listening to that track for the first time, and apparently 25% of my listeners are under 40, you are likely experiencing a complex mix of bewilderment and profound acoustic fascination. It's an astonishing piece of music. It features a sweeping acoustic guitar, a mandolin-drenched arrangement, and a vocal delivery that treats a standard pop melody with the gravity of a Puccini opera. And let's be fair, it's all a bit cheesy. It's like being sat in a trattoria in London, about to eat your antipasti, and a singing waiter comes out, literally in this case. Let's dig into the story of this one. It's a kitsch classic, starting with the man whose powerful tenor voice anchored the entire production. Renato Pagliari was born on June the 28th, 1940 in Rome. He settled in the UK as a young man, choosing to live in the West Midlands region. He made his living combining his culinary skills with his musical passion, working as a waiter in restaurants across Birmingham. He quickly earned a local reputation as a singing waiter who would frequently burst into Neapolitan standard songs and classic operatic arias for surprise diners during his shifts. His booming, passionate voice also landed him another legendary slice of British pop culture. He provided the famous vocals for the long-running Wall's Ice Cream television adverts, singing the famous Just One Cornetto jingle set to the tune of O Sole Mio. Bet you didn't know that one. His big break into the mainstream music industry began in 1975 when he auditioned for the popular ITV talent show New Faces. While he didn't win the competition, his passionate television performance caught the eye of an English songwriter and producer named Johnny Edward. Edward, who wrote the songs with his wife Sue, was looking for a specific type of vocalist. Edward had written Save Your Love as a tongue-in-cheek reaction to the overwhelming success of Brotherhood of Man's 1976 Eurovision-winning pop smash Save Your Kisses for Me. Edward wanted to create something intentionally overblown, a dramatic caricature of an Italian love serenade. However, fun fact number 2, Edward got sidetracked by a completely different project. For several years, he became fully occupied creating, voicing and controlling the hit fictional robot character Metal Mickey, which became a hugely popular children's television show between 1980 and 1983. Metal Mickey, that takes me back. Utterly forgettable kids' TV. Never quite got the premise, but I was still probably a bit young. For anyone new to Metal Mickey, think R2-D2 only built 3 times bigger and was a spin-off from a Mickey DeLenz show, and he had a catchphrase of boogie boogie boogie. Anyway, once the robot madness settled, Edward returns to his shelved Italian ballad. Remembering the singing waiter from New Faces, he contacted Renato and paired him with an accomplished British session singer named Hilary Lester, who was given the stage name Renee. Also weird was the fact that I also thought Renee was the man, possibly due to Renee Artois, the character from the much beloved sitcom 'Allo 'Allo, which, you've guessed it, also had a pilot around the same time, December 1982. Stick with me folks, this is a complicated segment. The duo recorded Save Your Love for Edward's independent label Hollywood Records. Released in October 1982, the single entered the UK Top 40 at number 38 on November the 13th. From there, it just snowballed. For a non-Christmas tune, it just seemed to capture the public's imagination right before the holidays, eventually climbing all the way to the top. It was the first completely independent single to reach number 1 on the UK charts, selling roughly 980,000 copies. It officially knocked the Jam's Beat Surrender, which we'll hear soon, off the number 1 spot, and claimed the coveted title of the 1982 Christmas number 1. That's right folks, the last ever Jam song replaced by this. The song stayed at number 1 for a total of 4 weeks until it was finally displaced by Phil Collins' cover of You Can't Hurry Love in January 1983. The single also found massive international success, peaking at number 3 on the Australian charts later in 1983. Now, if this weird story could get any weirder, well, brace yourself, it does. By the time the song became a hit, Hilary Lester had already moved on to join another musical group and didn't want to appear in the promotional material. Because she was unavailable to promote the record, a model named Vivian Marshall was hired to appear alongside Renato in the iconic music video and on television performances like Top of the Pops. The music video is a slushy, soft-focus romantic trope. It features Renato wearing tight pullovers, passionately singing the ballad directly into the face of a stony-faced, serious-looking Renee, played by Marshall. He wanders through romantic backdrops, dramatically throws a rose up to her bedroom window, and the video even closes with the shot of them holding hands in bed. Following their sudden brush with superstardom, the professional relationship quickly faded. The duo released a contractually obligated follow-up single titled Just One More Kiss, which only reached number 48 in the UK and number 55 in Australia. A third single, Jesus Loves Us All, completely failed to enter the charts, leading Johnny Edward to dissolve the project. Hilary Lester returned to her career as a session vocalist. Renato Pagliari returned to his roots, performing on cruise ships and regularly singing at a restaurant called Renato's, opened by his son Remo in Tamworth, Staffordshire. A passionate fan of Aston Villa Football Club, Renato was famously invited by team manager Ron Atkinson in the 1990s to sing Nessun Dorma on the pitch at half-time to motivate the players after a poor first-half performance. He remained a beloved figure on the British nostalgia circuit, making good-natured cameo appearances on TV for shows like Room 101, Little and Large, and Nevermind the Buzzcocks. Renato passed away on July the 29th, 2009, at the age of 69. He left behind a legacy defined by one of the most delightfully unexpected, unapologetically daft and cheesy number ones in British pop history. For our penultimate track on Playlist 49, we're back with the story of Rush. We last left the Canadian trio bassist and vocalist Geddy Lee, guitarist Alex Lifeson and drummer Neil Peart at the absolute peak of their powers. Their 8th studio album, Moving Pictures, had just conquered the world. It delivered Tom Sawyer, a song that became an era-defining rock anthem and arguably a first ballot entrant into the pantheon of rock music. They had filled stadiums, proved that progressive rock could be hummable, and achieved everything a rock band could ever dream of. But Rush was never a band comfortable with standing still. As Alex Lifeson noted, they could have stayed right where they were, doing the same thing over and over, but that simply was not who they were. Instead of replicating the formula of Moving Pictures, they chose to look forward into a new decade. They stepped into a world dictated by new technology, new waves of music, and an instrument that would completely reshape their dynamic, the synthesizer. Here is a track that ushered in this radical new chapter. This is Subdivisions, track 12 today. When Rush returned with their 9th studio album, Signals, in September 1982, the very first things fans heard was a deep, low Oberheim OBX synthesizer note. It was the opening of Subdivisions. This almost acted a little like a manifesto for them. While synths had been used for texture on previous records, Signals pushed them directly to the melodic front lines. The track is built on an intricate 7/4 time signature riff, driven entirely by Geddy Lee's keyboards. This change in sound, however, did not happen without significant friction inside the band. Guitarist Alex Lifeson found himself pushed to the margins somewhat, his guitar work reduced to angular chords and textural fills rather than the roaring riffs of their past. The shift made Signals one of the most divisive albums in Rush's catalogue, making a hard transition into a keyboard-heavy era. But also, with Lee focusing on keyboards, the drummer Neil Peart and Lifeson effectively became a dedicated rhythm section, allowing them to tune into each other's parts more directly. Beyond the synths, Subdivisions represents a massive turning point for Neil Peart as a lyricist. For years, Peart had written about mythology, science fiction, and fantasy. But with this track, he turned his pen towards the human experience. Peart described the song as an exploration of the background from which all of us, and probably most of our audience, have sprung. The song captures the crushing weight of suburban conformity and alienation. Peart grew up in the suburbs of St Catharines, Ontario, where he spent his youth reading as an escape from the rigid social structures around him. The lyrics paint an emotional picture of the geometric order of the suburbs, where anyone who does not fit in is cast out. The absolute chill of the chorus line, subdivisions, in the high school halls, in the shopping malls, conform or be cast out, became a clarion call for every misfit who ever felt suffocated by their surroundings. There's also a famous piece of trivia hidden right in that chorus, one that's been misreported for decades. Many fans believe the deep spoken word delivery of the word subdivisions belongs to Toronto newscaster Mark Daly. However, Neil Peart himself voiced that part in the studio using his own deep tone to deliver the institutional heavy pressure of the lyrics. The accompanying music video further cemented this connection to reality. Filmed around the Greater Toronto area, including locations in Scarborough and Don Mills, it contrasted the band playing in a studio with a young student navigating the lonely, repetitive architecture of suburban life, the homogeneity of the houses and new builds and video arcades. And for any retro game nerds out there, the arcade game featured is Atari's The Tempest. Though the heavy synths initially shocked old school fans, Subdivisions grew into a monumental fan favourite and a staple of Rush's live sets for decades. Even when trading guitars for keyboard, Rush remained fiercely progressive, entirely honest, and deeply connected to the hearts of their Canadian audience. Let's end today and playlist 49 with an absolute 80s classic and a song I saw played live literally at the weekend at Rewind Festival. And it was as good then as it was in 1982. When we last crossed paths with the synth-pop duo Blancmange in 1982, Neil Arthur and Stephen Luscombe were navigating the mid-tier of the UK singles chart with their dark, brooding electronic single Feel Me. It was an intense, desperate call-out that ultimately stalled at number 46 in the UK charts. London Records, their supportive but expectant record label, knew the band had something special, but they desperately needed a proper commercial breakthrough to justify the recording budget. The duo returned to the studio with producer Mike Howlett to craft what would become their debut studio album, Happy Families. What followed next was an unexpected mixture of DIY synths and classical Indian instrumentation that would completely redefine their career and embed itself forever into the fabric of 80s pop culture. Let's cue up this absolute gem. This is Living on the Ceiling, our final track today. Live, this song just absolutely tramples you, especially when they turn up the bass for that festival sound. It was amazing to hear it performed, and Neil Arthur still has that commanding presence on stage, that unmistakable frantic energy, and that propelled Living on the Ceiling straight into the UK top 10, where it peaked at number 7 in 1982. It stayed on the UK charts for an impressive total of 14 weeks, completely transforming the band from art school electronic experimenters into mainstream household names. But how did this brilliant, bizarre record actually come together? Well, the entire musical story begins with a simple, fortunate mistake. While working on new material, Neil Arthur was messing around on a guitar and made a physical error. He accidentally stumbled onto an unintended melody that possessed a distinct Middle Eastern feel. Rather than discarding this happy accident, the duo decided to fully embrace it. When their record company heard the rough demo, they suggested leaning heavily into that sound. The label introduced Arthur and Luscombe to two classic session musicians, Deepak Kazanchi, who played the sitar, and Pandit Dinesh, who provided the intricate rhythms on the tabla. The lyrical origin of the track is equally grounded in the realities of everyday life. Neil Arthur actually wrote the quirky lyrics in an old discarded diary that he picked up from a college summer job working for a local council in London. Lacking initial confidence in his own creative writing and fretful about his spelling mistakes, he kept the words to himself. It was his partner who discovered the diary and encouraged him, noting that great ideas matter far more than perfect spelling and suggesting that even professional authors use editors. With that boost of confidence, Arthur shared the words with Stephen Luscombe, and the track's iconic, anxious imagery about domestic claustrophobia was born. When Blancmange took the track to Top of the Pops in late 1982, the visual contrast on television was striking. Neil Arthur stood front and centre with his intense, tall stature and sharp suits, delivering quirky, idiosyncratic vocals, while Stephen Luscombe operated the synths behind him, all underscored by the presence of Dinesh and Kazanchi playing traditional Indian instruments. As experiments go, it could have been a clumsy attempt of world music integration, but instead created a joyous, high-energy synth-pop hybrid. The success of Living on the Ceiling opened the floodgates for the duo. They were now far more than a novelty art pop act, paving the way for them and setting the stage for their commercially massive 1984 follow-up album, Mange 2. The Renee Renato entry might be one of my favourites throughout this entire run. Getting Metal Mickey and Hello Hello into an entry feels sort of strangely good, like it's important that we also talk about the broader aspects of pop culture at the same time. Metal Mickey, I can't remember being that popular, but Hello Hello was compulsory viewing on Saturday, right before Casualty and then Howard's Way, but those were a few years away. Anyway, I must stop or I'll start talking about Tripods, Robin of Sherwood, and myriad other TV shows like Bergerac. Anyway, do join us next week as we push further into November 1982 and Playlist 50, which, if you're counting at home, is also the 99th episode of the pod, just one away from the ton. We briefly meet the legendary Marvin Gaye for some sexual healing. We also meet 70s hitmakers America for a short magical flirtation. Clannad reveal themselves with a stunning TV theme. Donna Summer makes a welcome return as she starts her 80s run. Hall & Oates and Flock of Seagulls both have amazing hits. And we end with Michael Jackson working with Paul McCartney yet again. So until then, have an incredible week. And we'll see you next time on I Completed 80s Music. Take care.